The Vietnam War was more than just a battle for territory or ideology. It was a descent into darkness, a nightmare beyond words. Beyond the conventional warfare, there were horrors so profound that they defied comprehension. Today, we uncover the brutal realities that history often fails to tell. The roots of the conflict. The war was born from decades of struggle. After nearly a century of French colonial rule, Vietnam's path to independence was stained with blood. When the French were finally defeated in 1954, the country was split into two: Communist North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh and anti-communist South Vietnam, backed by Western powers, particularly the United States. This division ignited a deadly conflict, fueled by Cold War paranoia and the infamous domino theory, the fear that if Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow. The guerrilla war and U.S. involvement with South Vietnam plagued by corruption and instability, the communist Viet Cong launched relentless guerrilla attacks. The U.S. responded with escalating troop deployments. By 1965, over 200,000 American soldiers were in Vietnam. Yet this was not a war of traditional battlefields. The Viet Cong turned the dense jungles into a labyrinth of traps, ambushes, and tunnels, rendering conventional warfare ineffective. American soldiers faced an enemy that could strike from nowhere and vanish into the shadows. Every village, every civilian could be a hidden threat. This fear and frustration would lead to tragic consequences. The unspeakable atrocities war breeds horror, but in Vietnam the lines between military strategy and sheer brutality blurred. Civilians became collateral damage, and in many cases, deliberate targets. One of the darkest chapters was the My Lai Massacre, 1968, where U.S. soldiers slaughtered over 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. The victims were executed, their villages burned to the ground. It was not an isolated incident. Systematic acts of violence plagued the war, with entire villages wiped out under search and destroy missions. The weaponization of sexual violence. One of the most horrifying aspects of the Vietnam War was the use of sexual violence as a tool of terror. U.S. soldiers engaged in systematic acts of assault, abduction, and exploitation of Vietnamese women. Some were forced into brothels set up near military bases, trapped in a cycle of abuse. These crimes were often ignored or covered up, leaving the victims voiceless and their suffering unheard for decades. A chilling example was the Hill 192 incident, 1966, where 5 U.S. soldiers kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered a young Vietnamese woman named Phan Thi Mao. The case only came to light because of a whistleblower, exposing a culture of impunity. The role of international forces in atrocities. The horrors of the war were not limited to American forces. South Korean troops deployed to support U.S. operations were responsible for their own series of brutal massacres. Entire villages were decimated, women assaulted, and civilians executed in ruthless counterinsurgency operations. Other Allied forces, including Australia and Thailand, faced accusations of war crimes, further entrenching the war's legacy of suffering. The legacy of horror. The Vietnam War left behind scars that transcend generations. Many survivors never received justice. The children born from war crimes, ostracized, abandoned, became living reminders of the brutality that took place. The psychological wounds linger, and the horrors remain imprinted on history's darkest pages. The Vietnam War was not just a battlefield of ideology. It was a descent into human depravity. A conflict where rules were shattered, and morality was often abandoned. We must remember these stories, not just to acknowledge the past, but to ensure that history's worst nightmares are never repeated. War exposes the darkest depths of humanity. The only way forward is to remember, to learn, and to never let history's horrors be forgotten. If you found this story compelling, share this video to shed light on history's untold tragedies. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the forgotten shadows of our past.